Hi everyone, it's Ryan here from Sprintax. Um, I'm also joined by my colleague Neil Duffy from the Sprintax team here as well.
Hi guys.
So today, I suppose we're here to help familiarize you all with your tax obligations as international students, scholars, and professionals. And I suppose the way this session will work is myself, Ryan, will go through the webinar. If it's okay with everyone else to mute yourselves as you're going through, because we do have this recorded, just so that we can get a good audio to send back to Darius and the team. Uh, we will leave time for Q&A at the end. I do know, and we do expect large numbers of people to attend this webinar. So Neil is also going to be helping to answer questions in the chat function of this webinar. So if you do have questions as we're going through, you can use the chat. Odds are I will probably answer some of those questions as we're going through the presentation. But if that's okay with everyone, to mute yourselves for now, and then at the very end, we'll leave time for Q&A and for people to unmute themselves as well. Additionally, Darius and the team at the international office, at the very end, if there's any school-specific information you'd like to make students aware of, I'd also invite you guys to unmute yourselves at the end to let them know. Great. So today I'm going to give you an overview of your tax obligations as international students, scholars and professionals. So I'll touch base on the differences between tax returns for non-residents versus your residents, American roommates or colleagues or co-workers on campus, and how you're treated separately to them. I will touch base on what you need to do this filing season, what tax forms you need to file, your federal and state filing obligations. There were some noticeable changes that impacted non-residents from what was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act about 2 tax seasons ago, and I will touch base on that as we go through the session. We helped about 165,000 international students and scholars last year, so we do have some tax behavior and refund statistics to share with you also there. And like I said, we will leave time for Q&A at the end, and Neil will also be able to address questions throughout the chat too. So before we start, I suppose we do have to show this disclaimer. Tax is a little bit like your own DNA, in that it might seem like Neil and Ryan are very much the same on paper, but for one small intricate detail, we could be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So it's very important to know that the aim of today's session is to give you a general understanding of tax principles as they apply to international students and scholars. So now that the disclaimer's out of the way, where to start? I suppose we usually start with the important dates. Whilst we are in the year 2020, we're actually looking at the 2019 tax filing season. And luckily enough, the tax filing season runs the same as the calendar year. So the tax year 2019 is exactly the same as the calendar year 2019. So the IRS are generally concerned about all of the time that you spent during the 1st of January to the 31st of December 2019 on US soil, as well as all the US income that you earned during that period of time as a non-resident for tax purposes. So even if you were present for a single day of 2019, it's probably likely that you'll have at least one tax filing obligation, and I'll touch base on that a little later on. The deadline as it stands to file your tax return to the IRS is Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. What we would always say is if you're ready to file your return, you'll save yourself a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety if you file earlier rather than later. Perfect example is last year we had a very popular TV show. Final episode aired on April 14th, 2019, and that was Game of Thrones. lots of folks decided to watch Game of Thrones rather than do their taxes on Sprintax April 14th, and caused them a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety when they had to file last minute on April 15th. So like we always say, if you're ready to file, try and do so as early as you can. So the concept of residency for tax purposes generally confuses most international students and scholars. I suppose it's important to know that it's independent of your visa or immigration status. So just because you're an international student doesn't mean you're a non-resident for tax purposes. However, the IRS generally have some clear guidelines in terms of residency for tax purposes when it comes to international students and scholars. So generally, most international students and scholars who are on F, J, M, or Q visas are considered non-resident for tax purposes. So what does that mean? In simple terms, it means different tax laws apply to you versus your resident, maybe American roommates or co-workers, and you'll need to file different tax forms with the IRS than your resident for tax purposes colleagues. International students on J1 and F1 student visas are automatically considered non-residents for their first 5 calendar years in the US. That's important to know that that does not need to be consecutive. So if you were present on an F1 visa, maybe during high school, those years would also add up to the years that you've spent maybe on F1 visa at Georgetown University as well. So it's 5 lifetime years. It doesn't need to be consecutive. For any scholars or researchers, trainees tuning in on J1 visas, you're automatically considered non-residents for 2 years. The clock's generally reset after 6 years if you were to return on a similar visa, but you get 2 years of non-resident status. After the 5-year period for in J1 or F1 students, or after the 2-year period for scholar researchers, you'll start counting your days towards the substantial presence test. Generally, it sounds like a crazy science experiment, but basically we'll count all of the days for the current tax year, a third of the days from the year before that, and a sixth of the days from the year before that. If that total amount of days reaches 183 or more, you'll generally be deemed a resident for tax purposes. Now, I know this is a confusing slide. The good news is that Sprintax will help to figure out whether or not you're a non-resident for tax purposes. So we will ask you for all of your entry and exit dates in and out of the US, the visa types that you were on during those visits, and we will use that information to make sure that you have or haven't passed a substantial presence test. So no need to get the calculator out here. We will do this thinking for you on the software. For anyone that's on other types of visas, here's quite a good breakdown of how many years you get in non-resident status or number of years exempt. On the right column as well is called FICA exemption. I'll touch base on FICA a little later, but if you see why it means you're generally exempt from FICA during that period of time that you're a non-resident under that visa type. And again, I'll touch base on that visa type, FICA taxes a little later. So we've kind of covered the concept of residency for tax purposes. I suppose the next answer to the golden question that's on most of your minds is probably, what do you need to do for this filing season? Who must file for 2019? I suppose in basic terms, if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, I'm guessing most of you are probably F1 or J1 students, everyone has a minimum filing obligation regardless of whether you earned US source income or not. So everyone must complete Form 8843 regardless of whether you spent 1 day of presence in 2019 or all 365 days, whether or not you earned US source income as well. In terms of who needs to file a federal tax return, the rule is quite simple there. Basically, if you earn any US source income above $0, you'll need to file a federal tax return by law. So Form 8843 is generally the minimum filing obligation for non-residents for tax purposes on F or J. It's called a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. It's actually a very simple tax form. think of it as a declaration of non-resident status, where you're providing this to the IRS to say, my name is Ryan, I'm an F1 student. Please do not count these days towards that substantial presence test because I'm still an exempt individual. It's a very simple tax form. The good news is that Sprintax will prepare this document for you so that you don't need to print it out and try and fill it in yourself. We will actually fill this in and populate this for you. If you just need to file Form 8843, it's important to know that you won't need a social security number or an ITIN if you just need to file Form 8843. For any of you that are receiving US source income, you're probably going to notice that tax is being withheld on that income, generally at around a rate of 30%. However, there are 65 tax treaties between countries all around the world and the US that aim to reduce this level of withholding, typically down to 14%, or to exempt that income entirely. So when you're filing your tax returns, think of it really as balancing the books with the IRS to make sure that you haven't overpaid or underpaid tax during that period of time. In terms of the federal tax filing requirement, the federal tax forms that you would need to file are called a Form 1040NR or 1040NR-EZ. They would be the two documents that you would need to file to the IRS. We will figure out which document is relevant to you. Most international students just need to file Form 1040NR-EZ, and as you can guess, it's the easier document. If you have generally a simple tax return, you just need to file the 1040NR-EZ. If you had more complicated circumstances, maybe you had some sophisticated investment income to report, or maybe you earned over $100,000 during the tax year, those are examples where you might need to file Form 1040NR. But Sprintax will do this thinking for you. We will figure out which tax form you need to file for this filing season. In terms of who needs to file those tax forms, well, again, the rule is quite simple here. Everything over $0 of US source income, if you earn anything over $0, you'll need to file a federal tax return by law. This is one of those changes that came about from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which reduced the personal exemption from $4,050 to $0. So essentially, anyone that earns any US income is getting taxed from the first dollar and will need to file a federal tax return by law. And I suppose it's important to look at US source income as not just the wages that you might be earning on campus, working in the library or in the cafeteria. If you're tuning into this and thinking you're not earning wages, well, think about what other US source income you might be receiving. Are you getting taxable scholarships? When I mention taxable scholarships, if your scholarship is just covering your tuition, this is non-taxable, doesn't have taxable implications. But things like getting stipends, grants, housing allowances, room and board, those types of scholarships are taxable. And again, if you earn anything over $0, you'll need to report this and you'll need to file a federal return. You might also be earning interest. Maybe you sold stocks or shares, or maybe you were renting your Airbnb in DC for more than 14 nights. There's also lots of gray areas of income. Maybe you're getting cash payments for singing in a bar, which again, we don't condone. Your visa probably doesn't allow it, but we have seen examples of it. Maybe you won big on the roulette table in Vegas and had gambling winnings. Maybe you participated in a focus group and were remunerated for that. These are some of those examples of gray areas, but in most cases, all are reportable and can trigger tax filing requirements. The good news is that most of the income you earn in a majority of cases are reported on an income document. So a very important slide, because you will need all of your income documents before you go through Sprintax to prepare your tax return. The most popular income document to get is your W-2. This generally reflects your wages, salary, or compensation that you earned during the 2019 tax year, as well as the tax that was withheld on that. Generally, folks will get their W-2 towards the very end of January. So if you haven't received your W-2 by now, you might need to follow up with your employer or your payroll department to make sure that you have it. Second most popular would be the 1042S income document. This generally reflects things like taxable scholarships, stipends, grants, or awards, and as well as income that is exempt due to a tax treaty. So certainly lots of folks get 1042Ss. They generally come later in the year. They generally are sent out by March 15th. So you should have received your 1042S by now if you're expecting to receive it. Again, as we always say, follow up with your payroll department or whoever issues the 1042S if you think that you still are waiting on that document. Finally, there's the 1099 series. There's a range of 1099 income documents, less popular with international students, but some may get it. If you had, for example, rental income in the US, or if you had investment income from selling stocks or shares, you might get a 1099 document to reflect that. Some income which doesn't have or doesn't trigger a filing requirement in the US. This is an important slide to know as well, because across most of the workshops and webinars we do, we see that this generally comes up as a question in terms of whether it has taxable implications. Firstly, if your scholarship is just covering tuition or tuition related expenses, this generally has no taxable implications and won't trigger a federal filing requirement. Secondly, a scholarship received from outside the US. So as you can probably tell, my accent is originally from Ireland. If Trinity College Dublin wanted to pay for me to study at Georgetown University, generally this would be seen as non-US source income and wouldn't have taxable implications in the US. Money transferred from parents or relatives. Again, America is not a cheap place to live, so it's not uncommon that parents or relatives will transfer money over to help with cost of living. Again, generally seen as non-US source income and won't have taxable implications. If your Airbnb was back home in Paris or Delhi or Shanghai, or if you're earning income in your home country, as long as you're a non-resident for tax purposes, the IRS will not look at your worldwide income. And given that this is non-US source income, it won't trigger taxable implications in the US. If you were a resident for tax purposes, the IRS would look at your worldwide income, and this would probably change. Finally, interest on a regular savings account. It probably won't buy you a cup of coffee in terms of the interest that you'd get on those, but generally it doesn't have taxable implications up until about $10 earned. If there is taxable implications, your financial institution would generally issue you with a 1099 income document to reflect that. So in terms of what items you need when preparing your return, so if you're ready to go into Sprintax and prepare your return this evening, what documents would you need? Well, very importantly, you'll need all of your income documents. So whether that's your W-2, 1042S or 1099s, make sure that you have all of your applicable tax documents, income documents. You'll also need information from your passport. You'll need information from your visa, so whether that's your I-20 if you're F, or DS 2019 if you're J. You'll need your entry and exit dates in and out of the US. Why on earth would I need this, Ryan? Generally, we need this information so that we can figure out whether or not you're a non-resident for tax purposes. So we need to ask you for all of your entry and exit dates in and out of the US and the visa types that you fell under during those visits to make sure that you are in fact a non-resident for tax purposes. Finally, you will need a social security number or an ITIN if you need to file a federal or state tax return. If you just need to file Form 8843, you won't need a social or an ITIN. A note on non-resident spouses and dependents. I suppose we often say at Sprintax, no matter how much you love each other, no matter how long you've been together, if you're here in the US as two non-residents for tax purposes, you cannot file jointly on your US tax return. So you'll be treated completely separately from a tax perspective. You'll be treated as two separate entities. You'll both need to file your own Form 8843. And if you have federal obligations, you'll need to file your own 1040 NR or 1040 NR EZ separately and mail them in separate envelopes. There is one area where you might be able to file jointly on a US on a resident return. That's if you're married to a resident for tax purposes. If you are married to a resident for tax purposes, you do have the option to either file jointly as a resident on the resident return, or you have the option to still file separately as a non-resident for tax purposes. With those cases, I would say do your homework to see what is most beneficial for your own circumstances. So FICA taxes, you'll probably notice on your W-2 that there's a section for Social Security or Medicare. That also falls under what's called FICA tax. And it's a tax that's supposed to help you later on in life with the cost of healthcare. I suppose in the eyes of the IRS, you're here for a temporary or transitory purpose. And generally, you won't be here long enough to see the benefit of paying into that tax. So non-resident international students and scholars on J1 or F1 visas should not be paying FICA, as long as you're a non-resident for tax purposes. It's not a blanket rule though. If you're H1B, J2 or TN visa holder, you are subject to FICA taxes from your first day of employment. What I would say here is if you have had FICA taxes withheld, the first thing you need to do is to approach your employer to ask them to issue you back with those FICA taxes that were withheld. We will actually be able to figure out on Sprintax if you have had FICA taxes withheld. We'll ask you if you have approached the employer. If they have refused, you can outline that to us on Sprintax. So if the employer has refused to issue you with a FICA refund, we can help to prepare a FICA tax return, which is called Form 843 and Form 8316. So a note on ITIN, if you've got a social security number, you won't need to worry about this slide. If you just need to file Form 8843, you won't need to worry about this either. This is most common amongst scholarship recipients or athletes who are not working, aren't eligible for a social security number, but are receiving taxable scholarships or income that needs to be reported on a federal return. In those cases, they would need to apply for an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number. It's a tricky process, and there's generally two ways to go about it. You can file an ITIN application in advance of filing your federal return. You can get your you need to fill out Form W7 here, and you would generally need to get your documents like your passport and visa certified by a responsible officer. If you're deciding to apply for your ITIN with your federal return, the rules change there, and your documents then need to be certified by what's called a certifying acceptance agent, or you might be able to use a local IRS office as well. It is a tricky process. We do see lots of rejections here, so we always say be ready to file a second time due to the high rejection rate on these. If you're getting a 1098-T, this generally reflects it's a tuition statement. It can only be used by residents for tax purposes to claim an educational tax credit. We see that it's probably the single largest cause of misfiling for non-residents, because many non-residents, again, like I did when I was an international student, live with fellow Americans or residents for tax purposes. It's not uncommon that you'll ask them what do they do for taxes, and they will probably suggest resident software, for example, TurboTax. And the problem there is that TurboTax cannot be used by non-residents, but they will presume that you are a resident for tax purposes, and they will ask you for information like your 1098-T. That would almost certainly be misfiling for you as a non-resident. So it's important to be very wary of the advice you're getting from friends or colleagues about what you can use for taxes. Sprintax is only focused for non-residents, and we will not ask you for the 1098-T because you cannot use it on your tax return, on your non-resident return. Similarly, Form 1095B or C is healthcare coverage provided through the employer or through the school. If you get these documents, keep them in a safe place, but you won't need them on your non-resident return because you cannot claim the credits that follow them. If you have received a Form 1095A, which is rare, this is where healthcare coverage is purchased through the common marketplace. We will ask you if you have received this document, and we can help to prepare your tax return to include this. In terms of state taxes, it's important to know that There are lots of states around the US, around 43, that have state income taxes. They also have their own rules in terms of tax residency. So it can be very difficult for students to understand that. The good news is that Sprintax will actually do this thinking for you. So when you're outlining your information on Sprintax, we will ask you for all of the time that you spent in and out of different states. We will ask you for the type of accommodation that you stayed in. We will look at how much income you earn in the state, and we will help to figure out and let you know whether or not you've triggered any state filing obligation, not only in DC, but also in any states that have state income tax. Generally, the rules in residency are, if you're there for a temporary or transitory purpose, you're generally deemed a non-resident for tax purposes. But again, your best bet is to go through Sprintax, and we will do this thinking for you to figure out what you need to do from a state tax perspective. In terms of timelines for a refund, let's say you're ready to file your tax return this evening. If you are due a refund, what are the timelines to get that back? Well, the IRS will give themselves about 6 months in the small print, but we would see anywhere between 6 and 8 weeks. Again, the later you file, the more chance that you're going to wait longer to get your refund back. Important to know that you can check the status of your refund, which is irs.gov/refunds. So that's a useful tool you can use to check the status of your refund. In terms of your return on Sprintax, you'll still need to print, sign, and mail the document to the IRS. It's very important to know that. And for those reasons, we always recommend using a tracked mail service so that you know that your tax return has arrived at the IRS's door. The IRS did introduce e-filing some seasons ago. They'd probably agree that it's not ready for all non-resident circumstances. So as a result, you still need to print, sign, and mail your documents to the IRS. If any of you are thinking like this individual in terms of maybe you've realized that you haven't filed for previous years, or maybe you filed as a resident by mistake using something like TurboTax or other softwares, what I always say is don't panic, but do set the record straight. We are in an era of increased scrutiny on all aspects of visa compliance, and tax compliance certainly is no different. So if you haven't filed, take the opportunity to go back and backfile for the years that you haven't filed for. You can backfile at any stage, and if you're due a refund, the IRS are actually happy to issue a refund back if it's within the last 3 years. If you've misfiled, for example using TurboTax, you'll need to file what's called a 1040X, which is an amended US tax return. You can Google the 1040X and the IRS will have a PDF which you can print out and populate. My recommendation there is prepare a correct non-resident return using something like Sprintax. Use that along beside your incorrect tax return and use both to fill out the 1040X. There is also an amended tax return service on Sprintax which you can use. So that might also be of interest for anyone that needs help with an amended tax return. We also have the ability for you to backfile on Sprintax. So you can backfile or select previous tax years that you need help with, and we can help to prepare previous years for you as well. Which leads nicely into implications of not filing. I suppose as an international student who once was in your shoes, I can't stress enough that this can affect future immigration status. So any of you that are looking to transition to longer term visas like H-1Bs, change of status, we're seeing that USCIS is sending RFEs looking for history of tax compliance. So we'd personally hate for your opportunity to transition to such visas to be hindered by your tax compliance or by not or failing to file or filing incorrectly. So definitely can affect future immigration status. It's part of maintaining your visa status currently. It's part of obliging by the US laws that are set out within your visa. If you owe the IRS money, fines, penalties, and interest can accrue. Of course, we don't want that. And again, let's say you worked hard, you might be due a tax refund, but the only way that you can get that back is by actually filing a tax return. Tax scams suppose we'd always say be very, very careful around tax scams. The IRS will never call you. They will never email you. You won't be getting a phone call from the IRS at 10 p.m. on a Friday night telling you that the police are on the way, they're about to deport you if you don't pay a substantial amount of money in a short period of time. That's not the way the IRS work. They're a government institution. If there's an issue with your tax return, they will send a letter in the mail. They will give you time to respond. I've already had cases already this year where students have been called. They've paid money over the phone. They've bought gift cards and read the labels on the back. I've also had an individual that had her social security number, taken from her over the phone. So please be very careful of this. If you're getting phone calls or emails from the IRS, please disregard them because it's not the IRS. If it's information around taxes from Georgetown University, from your international office, from Sprintax, that generally is legitimate. But if someone is claiming to be from the IRS over email or phone call, please disregard them and let the international office know. It's so prevalent that you'll see that it's on most international tax websites. So just be very, very careful around this. So in terms of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, for any of you that have been in the US a couple of years, you might have noticed this where it used to be the case you had a personal exemption of $4,050. And that basically meant that if Ryan earned below that amount, he wouldn't be taxed on any of that income and wouldn't need to file a federal tax return unless he reached that $4,050 limit. Unfortunately, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was removed and reduced to $0. So basically that resulted in non-residents getting taxed from their first dollar earned and having to file a federal tax return by law, even if they earned a single dollar of US source income. Whilst the exemption was reduced, the standard deduction was increased. That has increased again from 2018 to 2019. It's now $12,200. Unfortunately, most non-residents cannot use the standard deduction, but Indian students and trainees can use it. So I suppose when we compare residents to non-residents, residents for tax purposes can still use the standard deduction. They can file jointly on their US tax return. They can use things like childcare credits or educational credits. On the flip side, non-residents cannot use most of those in most circumstances. They do have a tax treaty between their home country if applicable, and Indian students and trainees can generally claim the standard deduction of $12,200. So we helped a lot of international students and scholars last year. And whilst we've been hammering on the door about compliance, there is also a monetary benefit in many cases of filing your tax returns. Whilst we'll always put tax compliance as number one, you'll see here that across 165,000 international students that used Sprintax last year, these are some of the refund statistics. And again, it's not any magic that Sprintax does. These are refunds that compliant refunds that you're eligible to get back if you're due them. So the statistics are on the federal side, over 70% received a federal refund. The average refund was over $1,000. On the state side, the average individual, or 72% of individuals, got a state refund, and the average refund was in and around $430. Again, that will differ from person to person. Not everyone will get a refund. Some might owe, some might have a nil balance. But again, it's part of maintaining visa compliance, but important to know that in many cases there are some monetary benefits to filing your tax return. So by this stage, you'll have received communications from the international office. You'll probably have received an email or newsletters with access to Sprintax. You'll generally have got a link to access Sprintax for Georgetown University and a unique code that you can use at the checkout. Please take note of that code because it will remove the cost of your federal and 8843 return. So very important to take that in mind. Once you follow the steps from your communication from your international office, you'll click on the link to Sprintax. You'll then be asked to log in, or if you've used us before, or to create an account if you've never used us in the past. From that point on, you'll then arrive, we'll start to ask you tax related questions. One of the very first questions is around residency. So this very first step will ask you for all of your entry and exit dates in and out of the US, and the visa types that you were on during those visits. We will use that information to figure out whether or not you're a non-resident for tax purposes. If you've been deemed a resident for tax purposes, we'll actually stop you at this page. We'll tell you that you can't use Sprintax, but in many cases we refer you to TurboTax if you can use resident software, where in many cases you can use the free file option. However, if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, we'll continue to bring you through Sprintax. And from that point on, we're a little bit like an accordion in that we're straightforward or longer-winded based on your own circumstances. So we'll ask you if you have received income in 2019. If you say that you have, we'll ask you for all of the income documents that you've received. So whether that was your W-2, your 1042S, your 1099s, and whichever documents you outline to us, we'll populate a blank version of that form. So it's simply a case of you transcribing the information from your income document that you received onto a blank version of that on Sprintax. It's important to know if you do have questions here, please try not to ask the international office. There is a function called Ask Stacey where you'll get access to our large bank of FAQs. If you still don't get the answer from your questions on our FAQ, there will be a link there to access our live chat facility. And there is also hello@sprintax.com, which is our email support that you can utilize. For anyone that has received income that wasn't reported on an income document, there is a facility to outline this on step 3. Then we'll start to ask about state taxes. So we'll ask for all of your visits in and out of different states across the US, the type of accommodation you stayed in, the type of visit, and we'll use that information with your income information to figure out whether or not you've triggered any state filing obligations during your time for this filing season. We'll then let you know whether you have, and we'll ask you if you'd like Sprintax to help you to prepare a state tax return. We will give you an estimated refund or O-case in the very next slide in terms of letting you know what we expect you to get back on your federal return as well as your state return if applicable, or whether you owe in those cases as well. You'll then arrive at the review your order page, and very important slide here. This is the section where you'll need to insert your code, and that code will remove the cost of your federal tax return and Form 8843. So very important to use that. There are additional services on Sprintax if you'd like to use them. State tax returns are the most popular, which are $29.95 per state return. If you needed to prepare a FICA return, that will be $14.95. We also have what's called post-filing insurance or post-filing service, where our team can handle any notices that you get from the IRS or tax authorities. Again, completely optional, but it's an optional service at $14.95. Once you get through this step, you'll arrive at a page that looks like this. Please don't take this as your job being done. You'll still need to open and download your tax pack, which will look like this, where you'll have a completed 1040 NR EZ, and you'll have instructions in your tax pack in terms of the address you need to send it to, that you need to include your income documents with your return, and that you need to print, sign, and mail the return to the IRS or the tax authorities. Once you've done that, you can hopefully relax and breathe, knowing that you've been tax compliant for another season and that you won't need to worry about tax until this time next year. I know that was quite a heavy tax session, so we'll end it on a lighter note. For any of you that know this chap, his name is Al Capone. He's known for lots of bad things during his time in the US. They didn't really catch him for most of those. If you can guess what they actually caught him for, it was not doing his taxes. He got 30 years in Alcatraz for it. Not saying that any of you are notorious US gangsters, but please do your taxes. It is very important. There is also additional support after this webinar. If you have questions after today, hello@sprintax.com is our email support. You also have our live chat support and FAQs to rely on. if you don't mind, if Darius, if you have anything else to add from the school side, I'd welcome just you to unmute yourself if you want to add anything else there, and then we might open it to Q&A from there on in.
Sure. Hi, guys. My name is Darius Snow. I am the program manager at Georgetown University's Office of Global Services. I hope everybody on this webinar has received all the multiple emails that I've been giving to you guys since February. But I first wanted to go ahead and thank Ryan and Neil for hosting this webinar. It's been a great help for me in our office, and I hope that this webinar has been helpful for you guys. The thing that I just wanted to add is to please go ahead and visit our tax website on the OGS tax website at internationalservices.georgetown.edu/tax. Ryan and Neil have basically covered everything, but that tax website is a resource for you guys if you guys have any more questions as well, in addition to Sprintax. If you guys are looking for the Sprintax code, you will need to go into the US source income button, and it should be step 1 on the tax filing process. I believe that's it for me.
Great.
Yeah.
One question, I don't know if you know it or not, Darius. It's quite common that students will ask where their tax documents are, like their W-2 from Georgetown, or maybe their 1042S. So I don't know, is there a specific payroll address that they might be able to reach out to? It's quite common that they might have questions like that.
Sure. So for students and scholars who received a Form W-2, you can find it in the GMS website. If you're currently an employee, you would just need to log into GMS with your Georgetown Net ID credentials. Go into the income document section, and you'll find the tax section to find your W-2. If you are no longer an employee at Georgetown University, you'll need to contact Payroll Services, and their email is payrollservices@georgetown.edu. Now, if you are looking for Form 1042S, if you received one, the Georgetown Tax Department should have either mailed it to you already, or they would have posted it electronically in their non-resident tax database. It's called FNIS. If you did not receive it electronically, if you haven't received it in the mail by now, they sent it out last week, you can email the tax department at taxdepartment@georgetown.edu.
Great. Thank you very much, Darius. That's usually always pops up on webinars. We do have a large population tuning in here. And so if people do have questions, we'll try and take it one by one. And if the rest can mute themselves again as we kind of address some of those questions. I know Neil has been handling lots of your questions on the chat. So thanks, Neil. Thanks, Neil, there. If there are additional questions, I'd invite you to try and unmute yourself. But again, let's try and take this in somewhat of an orderly fashion if we can. Anyone with questions?
Hi, this is Andres Angel calling from Bogota, Colombia. I have a question. I've never used Sprintax. How do you access Sprintax? Can you go over that again? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, so there's basically a link to Sprintax that's been provided from the tax page, I believe, Darius, of the Georgetown, the international. There should be a tax page specifically for you I know Darius mentioned it there a little earlier. There should be a link to Sprintax there for you. And then you can simply create an account, and from that point in, it's an online tax questionnaire, and then we'll prepare the tax documents that are relevant to you. Again, you'll need to use your code, and then you'll need to print, sign, and mail the tax documents from Bogota. What I would recommend there is to use a tracked mail service, just because you're sending it from quite a distance, just to make sure that it arrives at the IRS's door. but it's an online software. It's a Sprintax is you can log on from anywhere in the world, which is the good news. But there is information that has come from the international office to you all with access to Sprintax, with the link to the Georgetown link to Sprintax, as well as your code that you can use.
Thank you.
No worries.
Hi, this is Jayesh here. I recently transferred from OPT to H1B, so I just wanted to understand what are the tax forms, how do I file my taxes? And I'm sorry if this was answered earlier.
No worries. Have you just transitioned to H1B in 2020, or was this during 2019?
This was 2019.
Okay. Your best bet there is to go through step 1 of residency on Sprintax, because we will help to figure out whether or not you're still a non-resident for tax purposes or not. There's a chance that you may be deemed a resident for tax purposes since you've transitioned to H1B. Depends on how long you've spent on that visa. So again, your best bet there is just to go through Sprintax, enter all of your entry and exit dates, your visa types, the visa types that you are under. So you'll have, I'm guessing you're probably on F1 during OPT, and then the day you transition to H1B, you'll outline that as a separate visit because you change your visa type. So you'll be able to outline that on step 1 of Sprintax, and we will help to figure out whether or not you can still file as a non-resident, or whether, based on that change, whether you'll need to file as a resident for tax purposes.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Hey Ryan, this is Blair. Thank you again so much for holding this webinar. So I had a question. I was a F2 student in high school from 2008 to 2012, and I was an F1 student from 2012 till now currently. And I just started generating income in the year of 2019. So my question is, how many years do I need to go back in terms of filing tax? Because I've never done it.
Yeah,
So
sounds it sounds like
yeah.
you've got a couple of forms to fill out there.
Sure.
You'll likely need to file Form 8843 for your times under F2. And then you transition to F1 student visa in 2012.
Yes, for my undergrad. And I did my grad here at Georgetown.
Perfect. So I suppose 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. I'm probably would assume that you'd have been a non-resident for tax purposes for those 5 years since you transitioned to F1. If you didn't earn income during those years, you would just need to file Form 8843. So it's a simple tax document. You won't need a social security number or an ITIN for it. Sprintax can help you with probably 16 and 15 if you wanted to use Sprintax for 16 and 15, just to make sure as well that you are a non-resident for tax purposes during that time, because the very first step is called residency. So you'll be able to enter all of your entry and exit dates during that period of time, and maybe take it that you're filing your Form 8843 for 2016 first, just to see your residency from that point. 17, 18, and 19. Again, the best, quickest way that you'll find out whether or not you're a non-resident for tax purposes is by going into Sprintax, selecting the tax year 2017 that you need help with, putting in those entry and exit dates to figure out whether or not you are a non-resident for that tax year as well. I suspect you'll be a resident for tax purposes for 17, 18, and 19. You didn't earn income for 17 and 18, you said?
No, I did not.
So it might be the case that just 19, you'll need to, put in that information on resident software like, say, TurboTax, to see what you need to do from a tax perspective there. But you don't need to file Form 8843 if you're a resident for tax purposes. So it's only for your time during non-resident status.
Okay.
So again, your time as on F2, also then your time when you transition to F1 visa, you would have had 5 calendar years to use under non-resident status. So you
Okay.
likely need to file a Form 8843 for those 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, Ryan. This is Shruti. I had a question about my W-2, which I've been filing on Sprintax currently. And my question is that my box 15 of, the state and state wages, tips, etc. I have 2 states on that because Georgetown University is in DC and I live in Virginia. So I have 2 states that have 2 different columns that are on it. And when I put that on Sprintax, it's giving me a sort of it says that the federal income reported is less than your state income, something like that, because I have 2 states on it. So I'm not sure what's going wrong here. This is the first time I'm dealing with working in a different state and living in a different one.
Yeah, some of those more intricate cases like that, I probably would prefer just to have a second look at it. If you want to email hello@sprintax.com just with
Okay.
that scenario. Again,
Okay.
like our response team are generally quick in coming back within a couple of hours or latest a day at the moment in time. So if you can, to try and maybe send them a screenshot of what you're seeing there, and just outline that you were, on this webinar, and that Ryan advised you just to get a second opinion from the team in terms of what you need to do there.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Thank you.
No
Yes.
worries.
Thank you.
Hi, Ryan.
I am Ed.
Yes, so I did ask Neil about this, but I just want to ask one more question regarding the filing taxes for investment. So I'll be graduating on May and be leaving the US. And I'm just wondering, and I intend to keep my investment within the US. I mean, it's not a large investment. It's definitely below 20,000 US dollars. So my intention is to keep those investments and to file taxes only for the investments, because obviously I'll not be doing any job within the US. So I'll not be receiving any W2, but I'll keep my investment. So is Sprintax non-resident is the perfect, I would say, platform for me to keep filing my taxes?
Yeah, if you're holding on to an investment, I suppose if you're getting a gain from your investment, let's say you got a gain in 2019, you generally get like an income document, a 1099 document to reflect that.
Yes.
If you're holding it, you generally won't get an income document. Now again, I'm speaking very broadly here, but generally you'll only need to file when you actually receive a gain on those investments. If you're holding it, generally there's no taxable implications as a non-resident in many cases. Again, I'm speaking very broadly here because I don't know the specifics.
So I usually my investment is usually with the very common platforms like Robinhood or Betterment. I'm not investing in specific complicated investment banking.
Mhm.
So it's just regular tools and platforms for the public. So
Gotcha.
I would receive the 1099s every year. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, they do. When I log in, for example, to my Betterment account, I would find it over there. Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So you'll be able to, in most cases, use your 1099 income documents on Sprintax. So there is a drop down in terms of all the different 1099 forms, and in most cases, you'll be able to select what 1099 form you got, whether it was a 1099 div or a 1099 INT. You'll be able to select that you received one or maybe you received multiple, and we'll populate a blank version of that document on Sprintax for you to fill in.
Perfect. So for the 1099, speaking of the 1099s, because I did yesterday try to upload my 1099s on to the Sprintax platform, I couldn't complete it because it was asking me for a state tax, and on the 1099s there were no state tax on the line 13.
Okay.
And I couldn't move to the next step. So what should I do? And I tried to approach the betterment, and it was saying that because this is investment from multiple states, so they don't put a state, like one state on the form.
Okay. Again, similar to the case beforehand, I'd rather have maybe our team have a second look. So if you're able to kind of email that query to hello@sprintax.com, and also if you can maybe send a screenshot of what you're seeing on Sprintax too,
Okay.
and just a synopsis of kind of what you're experiencing, they're generally able to kind of point you in the right direction there. Because generally there's some parts of our team that are specifically dealing with investment income and might be able to point you in the right direction there. So my advice would probably be to do that.
Gotcha.
Just to make sure that we're pointing you in the right direction there.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Atman.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
This is Sylvia. I have a question about investment. We did buy some stocks in the stock market in 2019, and do we really need to report that even we didn't gain money because of, the crisis or something?
If you were holding the stocks, in most cases, there won't generally be tax implications until you actually realize a gain on that. And if you did realize a gain, you would probably get a 1099 from that institution. So your best bet is just to make sure with that institution that you don't have a 1099 or don't expect to have one for 2019. I probably would expect that you won't. And if that's the case, you probably won't need to report that on your non-resident return because you're still holding the stock. It's probably there until you realize a gain or a loss. Generally, as long as you're holding it, it won't have tax implications until you realize that gain.
Ryan, let me say one
you.
thing though. For the one who's asking about this unrealized gain, there is something called unrealized gain. So even though you don't sell the stocks, but you gain some money on those stocks, I think you need to file them. It's called unrealized gain, if I'm not mistaken.
If you're gaining, correct. But again, I suppose when we get to investment income, there are a multitude of different avenues you can go down here. And I always say to folks when they have questions like this, that you are better off reaching out to our support team like hello@sprintax.com just to make sure that we can touch base with our enrolled agents just to make sure we're pointing you in the right direction. When you talk about investment income, can sometimes be very, very complicated, and we'd rather not be able to. It's very difficult for us to also give you straight up advice on investment income over a webinar without asking probably a multitude of different questions. So I do recommend that if you can, to try and email our email support to try and get that best answer back for you.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much everyone that tuned in. We do really appreciate that you spent over an hour listening to non-resident taxes. So from myself and Neil, thank you very much for your time. Thank you also, Darius, for tuning in and outlining some important tax information there. Again, we have this recorded, so I will be sending this to Darius. Again, you have our additional support outlined here if you need any additional help. But thank you, everyone. I know it's a difficult time with the virus and everything else that's going on. So we all wish you very good health, and thanks again for tuning in.